Lauren Hudak. I'm a senior at Seaholm High School, and the name of my big board is the United States Intervention, or the real price of the United States intervention in the Middle East. I'm going to start out with some facts, some numbers. 654,965 Iraqis have lost their life as a result of the Iraq War. 21,000 civilians are estimated to have died as a result of the war in Afghanistan. 20,000 to 50,000 civilians have been slaughtered in Pakistan. In terms of U.S. casualties, over 6,000 American soldiers have lost their lives in the Middle East, and 1 million have been wounded, in addition to the 2,753 American civilians that have been killed as a result of the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001. This isn't counting the multitude of American civilian casualties that have occurred and as a result of Islamic terrorist attacks, such as the U.S. Embassy bombing of 1993 and 1998, the Boston Marathon bombing of 2013, and the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. So, yes, these numbers are horrifying, and they serve to prove a very important fact, very obvious fact that many of you have probably encountered a lot during the past couple of years, that our regions are at war. Conflict has been widespread in both regions, and it's affected all of our lives. So why is this important? I'd like to talk a little bit about the nature of the war, the root causes of the war. Obviously, this is a huge, long, hairy subject, and I know I probably didn't even get close, but I tried my best, and I'd like to talk to you about kind of what I found out and the conclusions that I've drawn. So I'd first like to talk a little bit about why this war is unique in compared to other wars. It's obviously it's ongoing. However, when looking at other wars, there's social distrust as a result, or there's social distrust between the two regions as a result of the war. This is true with this conflict, this is true with any conflict. However, this conflict is different in that the social distrust between our two regions is actually helping to fuel the war and changing it. So this is it manifests itself in the form of terrorist attacks, it manifests itself in the form of social distrust between the two regions. So this is very important because it actually affects the political, the foreign policy that exists between the two regions. And so this kind of brings me to my thesis, which is that the widespread conflicts that exist between the U.S. and the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted in political necessity to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about the kind of history nature of the war. I'm going to talk about some events that occurred in the latter half of the 20th century leading up to 9/11. And I want to kind of specify that obviously I can in no way cover over 60 years of political history between two nations. And I'm not going to talk about the most devastating conflicts. I'm not going to talk about even the most important conflicts. I'm going to talk about the conflicts that kind of seem to me to really best characterize U.S. political action in the Middle East prior to 9/11. So first I'm going to talk about the official recognition of the State of Israel in 1947 by the UN. And I'll talk more about the Israeli-Palestine conflict later in the presentation. I'm sure many of you in this room know a lot about or know at least an adequate amount about the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Most of you because we studied it in Flex, and also just because it's a hot topic today in politics, and you can have a conversation with almost anybody about the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and they'll have an opinion. I'm sure there are many differing opinions in the room today. I'm going to try and do my best to kind of explain it just using facts and not actually taking a side. So anyway, the U.S. in 1947 recognized the State of Israel officially, and this definitely put ourselves in a negative view for most of the countries in the Arab League, just because we were officially allying ourselves with a country that they were at war with. So it might not have been officially declared war. However, there is and has been conflict between Israel and all of the countries in the Arab League in the past 50 years. So when we allied ourselves with Israel, it automatically put us at odds with these countries. So this kind of started, even though we had obviously political intervention in the Middle East prior to this, this kind of this was one of the big strategic political moves that kind of showed how much power we had in the Middle East at the time, and how much power, it kind of was foreshadowing for how much we were going to be able to police the Middle East. So a lot of the two other events I'm going to talk about happened in the midst of the 50s under President Dwight Eisenhower. First, the Iranian coup d'etat of 1953, and this happened when the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, sought to nationalize the Iranian oil production, which was then owned by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and they took about 90% of the profits. So Prime Minister sought to nationalize it. Britain called upon America for help because at the time we had a lot of influence, not just in the Middle East, but in the entire world. We were on our rise to becoming one of the major superpowers. Eisenhower's administration had done really well, especially after World War II, in kind of boosting our economic and political proficiencies. So we were called upon to help Britain in keeping the ownership of Iran's oil production. So we were called upon them, and we staged a coup in Iran, which put leadership in charge that was sympathetic to oil interests in the European countries. So there are many different reasons why America could have done this. At the time, it was seen mostly because we were an ally to most European countries, such as Britain, and our allies left over from World War II. However, since then, Eisenhower's administration has made it clear that they were wary of nationalism in the Third World during the 50s in the Middle East. They were wary of communism basically spreading. And this is what most of our political action in the 50s was deemed as a result or a reaction to communism. And this was no different. So we were wary of any sort of nationalism. We were concerned with what it perceived as the spread of communism in an attempt to nationalize any sort of oil production. We didn't want third world countries to gain power. We didn't want them to gain their own. We didn't want them to come into themselves. So we staged a coup, and this set a very important precedent that the U.S. was willing to interfere in the political order of a foreign country to further its own agenda. And so this is very important. It's an example of political strategic action in the Middle East at its finest. Prior to 9/11, we were able to completely disrupt the order of a foreign country, and this was all just to kind of do what we do best, stop the spread of communism, establish a foreign order. So this happened again with the Suez Canal crisis of 1956. And this was a very similar situation. Egyptian President Nasser looked to nationalize the Suez Canal, which was a very important economic and political trade route. It was then duly owned by Britain, France, and a little bit of Israel. And America actually wasn't called upon to help, but we saw that Egypt was threatened with armed aggression. And it seems that President Eisenhower's administration, after many historical kind of accounts and analyzing his administration's moves, it seemed that once again he was afraid that this would kind of strike, or this would be able to, or be another way for communism to spread in the Middle East. And this time it was because they were worried that Egypt would Russia would actually come to Egypt's assistance if they were acted upon by armed aggression from British and France after trying to nationalize the Suez Canal crisis. So Eisenhower introduced what is now known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, and this is a very, 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 very influential doctrine at the time. The U.S. Department of State's Office of the Historian claims that under the Eisenhower Doctrine, a country could request American economic assistance and or aid from U.S. military forces if it was being threatened by armed aggression from another state. So this doctrine set yet another very important precedent in the Middle East. It was now officially America's job to police the formal governments of the Middle East. So we did this with the Suez Canal. We did this with Iranian coup d'etat. And so we were basically setting ourselves up as one of the most influential forces. We were able to solve problems between governments in the Middle East with using actually little to none military intervention at the time, basically just telling them, hey, back off. So that was what America was doing at the time. So this is obviously, once again, a very generalized statement. However, in the interest of time, I am going to make a very bold claim that after this political intervention that America staged in the 50s, in the latter half of the 20th century, certain extremist elements in the Arab world began to organize against American interests globally. So basically here I'm saying that many of the terrorist events that occurred in the latter half of the 20th century and that are still going on today are a result of U.S. intervention in the Middle East. And so this can be shown in many ways. First of all, by looking at a U.S. favorability rating by most of the countries in the world today. And this was taken all the way from 1999 up through 2014. I'm going to use the polls from 2014 because that's the one we have the most information for and that's most relevant today. And it shows very, very clearly that the main players in the Middle East, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, gave the U.S. some of the lowest favorability ratings of any country in the world. So most countries other than the U.S. that they give, say France, Germany, Greece, Italy, countries in South America, countries in Asia, got at least above a 50%. So an overall favorable rating. However, the U.S. got in almost every single case, besides, of course, Israel, because we are the biggest ally, we got under 50%. Sometimes, in some cases, you can see as low as 10%, 12%. So not great. We got very low favorability ratings from countries in the Middle East. And that just shows, considering that it's polling an average citizen's favorability. So it proves that there's social distrust. It proves that there's social distrust between our two regions. And so this social distrust has manifested itself in many ways, terrorism being one of them. So The social distrust comes as a result of many things. As with the Middle East is a huge region, with many countries in it, and the U.S. is a huge superpower. However, I'm going to kind of narrow it down to two major events. After doing much research, many people cite these main two events as part of the reason for the distrust between our two regions, and that's the Iraq War and the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And in response to the Iraq War, according to this poll, a majority of Iraqi respondents say that the impact of the war has been negative with respect to their personal safety and security. 72% of people polled in this war said that, the Iraqi citizens that were polled claim that. And so that's just a huge whopping statistic, because that was never the intention of the Iraq War. It was not to damage or in any way negatively damage the personal safety and security of Iraqi citizens. However, it did. Over 100,000 civilians were slaughtered in the Iraq War. And so this is usually listed at number one on the list of grievances that the Middle East has against the United States. Also, the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Once again, I kind of did mention this earlier in the presentation, but I'm going to kind of expand on it a little bit. Many different opinions probably on the Israeli-Palestine conflict. However, it's generally agreed upon that the Israeli-Palestine conflict comes from Palestine's belief that that Israel is illegally occupying their territory, and from Israel's refusal to, leave. Israel is calling upon, or Palestine is calling for complete evacuation of the land. Israel refuses, so there's an armed conflict between the two kind of nation states. Palestine does occupy, the state of Israel occupies. There are designated territories on the Gaza Strip and other smaller territories within Israel. And so the Palestine is mainly an Arab-occupied state, and Israel is Jewish-occupied. And so Palestine generally is it's part of the Arab League, and it's much supported by the Arab League. And so when the U.S. began to ally itself with Israel, we kind of we allied ourselves against many Middle Eastern countries. And so thus, according to this person, members of the Arab world have made it clear that any country that publicly supports and defends Israel in its fight to stay alive has declared itself anti-Islamic. So this is a huge word. This is a huge phrase to throw around, anti-Islamic, because it is meant to characterize an entire country's feelings about an entire region, an entire culture. Anti-Islam, Islamophobia. Many might have heard that Islamophobia thrown around. This is a word that some people use to describe their feelings towards Islam. This is a word that some members of the Arab League and some members of Islam use to describe what they perceive to be others' feelings towards them. And whether it's being used by one side or by another, it is a very, it's detrimental to our relationship. Anti-Islamic, Islamophobia, all of these things do nothing but perpetuate the negative trust, or the social distrust that we have between these two regions. So this social distrust can kind of be seen starting with the first early terrorist attacks against America by members of the Middle East, and this kind of started in the latter half of the 20th century again. I'm going to start with a couple. I'm just going to list a couple. April of 1983, with the bombing of a U.S. embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. This has been traced back to Islamic Jihadist Organization, which was a fundamentalist Shia group. The World Trade Center bombing of February 26, 1993. Kenya and Nairobi dual simultaneous U.S. embassy bombings that occurred in 1997. The 2000 attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. Many Islamic fundamentalist groups are to blame for these attacks. However, leading up to when you get closer to 2000, we see that many of them can be more clearly traced back to Osama bin Laden and his terrorist group Al-Qaeda. And so with each subsequent attack, they gained more influence, Al-Qaeda became more influential in the Middle East, and they were able to gather enough resources to commit what was inarguably the most heinous act that has ever occurred on American soil, which is September 11, 2001, the bombing that occurred then. And so kind of in history, in my paper and in this presentation, I use 9/11 kind of as a turning point. It kind of characterizes the huge shift that occurred in U.S. Middle Eastern relations prior to 9/11, post 9/11. So 9/11, before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, U.S. intervention was generally to settle political disputes between formal governments in the Middle East and to establish ourselves as a world superpower and for strategic political gain. However, prior to 9/11, we were actually invested in the War on Terror, which was an ideological war many believe brought about by 9/11. It was as a response to 9/11. So this was in studying the relationship between these two countries. It's also important to look at certainly relevant to examine how the average American citizen's perception of the Middle East and its inhabitants stood after 9/11. So I have a poll here, not downloaded, but I have a poll that shows American favorability ratings towards Arabs, and this very much reflects the results of the poll of Arab favorability ratings towards Americans. It's very similar. All of the favorability ratings are generally under 50%, lower than any other country, really. I mean, in exception to maybe Cuba, but other than that, yeah, it gets the lowest favorability ratings. And so another really interesting facet of this poll is that it shows the bipartisan divide in opinion. It shows Romney voters and Obama voters' view of Arabs. And even though, obviously, both are still under 50%, still lower than any other region, you see a very, very clear trend in that the Democrat voters are closer to 50%, whereas the Republican voters are closer to 0%. And this is unique because, as you can see, the favorability ratings out of every other country vary only in about 5 to 10% at the very, very most. However, with the Arab favorability ratings, they vary almost 30 to 40%. And so this is a huge deal just because it proves that the social distrust that Americans have for Arabs has political basis. It's as a result of political action. So this is very, very important in proving the thesis. So also the results of this poll serve as probable evidence to support the claim that the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks almost shocked America into supporting the war on terror. And so the years following September 11, 2001 marked a huge change in U.S. foreign policy. The wars that followed were long, they were costly, they were bloody, they involved a lot of American life, and they involved a lot of civilian life. And this is just wildly different from the U.S. intervention that we saw before, which was mostly political intervention. It was mostly by the book. It was not as much, there was little to no military intervention. Although, of course, there were some isolated incidents. However, it was not nearly as widespread as after 9/11. So it marked a huge change in U.S. foreign policy. So the U.S. was now forced to defend itself in ways it never had before. And not only to defend, but also to attack. It was forced to establish a new foreign order in a country. So basically, at pre-9/11, the relationship between the U.S. and the Middle East had reached an all-time low, while social distrust was at an all-time high. So this kind of brings me to the end of talking about the characterization of the conflict and how it's transformed between the two regions. So as this has been kind of a very rushed, very fast, very fact-heavy presentation, I'm going to go back to my thesis really quick as a refresher of what we're trying to prove here. And that's that the widespread conflicts that existed between the U.S. and some parts of the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted in political necessity to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action. And so first, we were able to talk about a lot of isolated incidents when talking in this presentation. So firstly, it can be seen that when the United States began its widespread influence in the Middle East, it was mostly civil conflicts and disputes between formal Middle Eastern governments, as well as for political necessity. This can be seen when we talked about the recognition of Israel as a state in 1947, so strategic political action. Same with the Suez Canal crisis of 1956, the Iranian coup d'etat of 1953. All of this was strategic political action, some in the attempt to dissuade, or not dissuade, but to dispel communism from the region, which was just definitely in America's, at the very top of the list in our political interests at the time, especially in the 50s. Secondly, it is clear that as U.S. intervention in the Middle East continued to grow, members of the Arab world had compiled a serious list of complaints that, when left unresolved, became fuel for this terrorist regime. Here we can cite the poll that we used, where we proved that there was social distrust. The poll that kind of summed up the average Iraqi citizen's response to the Iraq War, the term anti-Islamic, all of this, as well as the many terrorist attacks that occurred near the latter half of the 20th century, the embassy bombings that occurred, the World Trade Center bombing, all of this as in response to too much political intervention in the area, to the U.S., in quotes, overstepping our bounds in the area. So lastly, the terrorist attacks on U.S. soil brought on by U.S. intervention in the Middle East marked an extreme change in U.S. foreign policy. So 9/11, which was pretty much the last major terrorist attack and the long list of attacks that occurred in the last half of the 20th century, which was brought on by U.S. intervention in the Middle East, brought on by negative feelings towards us in the Middle East as a result of our past political action, marked an extreme change in U.S. foreign policy. The war on terror was very different from anything that occurred before it. Before we had political disputes. After it was a long, costly, bloody war that took many American lives, many Arab lives, basically changed the relationship between our two regions for forever. So this kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. I know this was a lot of information to absorb in 20 minutes. I kind of had to gloss over a lot, so I invite you to read my research paper. Just come up to me and ask me, because there's a lot more detail, a lot more depth, and a lot more examples and quotes, and I found a ton of good information. And if I can say anything that you could take away from this, I would really hope that you do a little bit of research for yourself, because prior to this, doing this kind of research project, I didn't know much about the conflict other than what I saw in mainstream media, and so I really challenged myself to kind of go further and to kind of establish my own opinions. And I found out a lot. I found a lot about I really was able to kind of transform how I felt about the conflict. So I would encourage everyone to do the same. Determine for yourself what the root causes of the conflict are. It's almost impossible because it's such a complicated conflict, but please try. Form some opinions, draw some opinions, and try and analyze. That's my advice. Thank you for listening.